Okay, we are back in First Kings tonight in chapter 2, and we're going to be talking about the power transition from from David to Solomon. About 20 years ago, I was in Nigeria. We were holding a pastor training event there, and at one point we were in a large area and had hundreds and hundreds of pastors gathered in there. I remember it raining so hard. I was supposed to be teaching. I'm yelling into this microphone. I'm sure nobody can hear me. And the guy just said, just keep going, And never forget that experience. Never forget the most beautiful offering I ever saw. Went on for about 30 minutes, where people that could give would give, and they danced up the aisle, and then the ushers would come and they would pass the money out to those who didn't give. And then those people were allowed to get and dance their way down the aisle and give. And this went on for a number of rounds, and so that everybody in the church had the blessing of giving, even those that showed up with no money. And so things like that were just amazing, stuck out in my mind. But at one point, towards the end of our time there, we were gathered in a small room, about 20 or 30 pastors, and they were bemoaning the state. Of course, this is 20 years ago. I'm sure it's much worse now, but they were bemoaning the political state of their country, that every politician was corrupt, and as Christians, they were conflicted as to who to vote for. I can't imagine what that must be like. And and so we're going around, and we're supposed to be there mentoring and teaching and coaching. And I remember I just said, well, I'm looking at this room full of leaders, and there were just so many dynamic leaders in that room. I said, well, why don't one of you run for president? And almost in unison, they were like, no. I'm like, why? He said, well, if a Christian enters politics, they are corrupted. And that was just the accepted norm. That at the moment you would throw your hat in the ring, it meant total and absolute corruption of your soul. And so they would rather sit around and bemoan the downfall of their nation, what could be a prosperous nation. They had tremendous oil resources. Yet they would rather do that than run the risk of damaging their own souls. I'll never forget that because it really stuck out at me. I wonder how many people wrestle with that or embrace the corruption. And I don't want to be political. I use that because we're going into this chapter where there is this power transition. And I bring up the example of Nigeria. You're probably already thinking of other examples. And I think we could probably go country by country for 200 plus, depending on how you count, 205 countries. And we would see corruption, we would see damage. And we'd find in many of the times for someone to take office, it meant to kill your predecessor. To keep them from influencing or usurping your authority. This has been the norm, believe it or not, longer than it's not been the norm. Especially when we go into the ancient Near East cultures, to take the throne meant to destroy any who might want to take it from you, which would usually refer to the kids from the previous regime. So that's kind of the setup as we come into 1 Kings chapter 2, we know that David is passing off the scene and Solomon is stepping up. And so I wanted to call this first part the handoff. And it starts out so wonderfully. And you just kind of would dream that in a really good political Hollywood thriller, that this would be the kind of advice being given to the up-and-coming protege that's rising to political office. Because this is David's charge to Solomon. Let's take a look. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong and act like a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as it is written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do, wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me, if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul. You will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. This is incredible. So David, and we don't know the time frame that goes from chapter 1 to chapter 2. There's often going to be gaps. There's often, sometimes it's going to be a real small gap, sometimes it's going to be a large gap. But considering how frail David was in chapter 1, I think chapter 2 follows rather immediately after, so I don't see a big gap in time here. And so he's giving Solomon his advice now that Adonijah's off the scene, hopefully, and Solomon is establishing his throne. This is David's advice to him, and what advice it is. He said, Solomon, you'll only be a man, you'll only be strong if you keep the covenant. Now remember, Israel was under the law of Moses. This was part of their covenant relationship with God. God had given them rules and guidelines to set them apart as a nation from all other nations. Now they knew that through them a Redeemer would come, but they weren't really focused on that. They were just focused on living life surrounded by enemies, trusting in their God to protect them. And David says, well, if you want our God to protect you, if you want to have prosperity, if you want to do well, then keep the covenant. It's great advice. And it's great advice if you're going to tell anybody how to be a man. Being a man involves sacrifice. Being a man involves taking a stand for things that are right. And he uses different words here, but these words are simply to break down the different aspects of the law of Moses. He says decrees and commands. These are the specific instructions that God forwards, is what you're going to find right in the book of Exodus. And then he talks about the laws and the requirements. These are going to be the case laws that come up afterwards, how those laws are applied, the rules for offering sacrifices, how daily living is to go about. So in these 4 words encompasses everything that God gave to his people to be successful. So for the new king to prosper, how he lives is important. Obedience will ensure success, and it will also guarantee that God fulfills what he promised David in 2 Samuel 7. We saw that many, many weeks ago when we were in Samuel, that God promised David that someone in his line is going to sit on the throne forever. And it's an unconditional promise. In other words, that it will happen. But there may be gaps in there because of disobedience. As long as there's disobedience, there's not a guarantee that someone will be on the throne. But if you'll obey, if you'll follow, if you'll trust God, he's telling them, then there'll be someone on the throne. So we have this great advice. Just as we're feeling good about the direction this is going in, it changes. And we have to talk about David's baggage. Now, the good thing is we just studied 1st and 2nd Samuel, so we understand David's baggage. David has a lot of baggage. It doesn't matter if you've made peace with your past. Your past may or may not have made peace with you. This is reality. My wife and I are amused that we're watching TV, and so often in these Hollywood shows, when somebody wants to really escape their past, where do they go? Costa Rica. We always laugh. It's like, because they got that in their minds, in the Hollywood storyline, going to Costa Rica means living under the radar. And I'm thinking, I need my schedule to go to the grocery store. There's no under the radar in Costa Rica. So these people that are trying to get away from their past, well, Costa Rica is not the right place. In fact, we want to make sure people know that, right? We don't want them coming here. Well, David had made peace with God. Of this, I have no doubt. David had his ups and downs. He was a man after God's own heart, and he had this righteous run that is unparalleled, but he was also a man given to lust, and it broke him in many ways. The scandals that came about in his life were tremendous and cost him and cost the nation quite a bit. And we're going to see Solomon, likewise. He's going to be full of wisdom. He's going to be a sage, but he's also going to be an idolater. So every potential hero we're met with in the Bible is going to have glaring flaws, and these guys are no different. So with David's baggage is particularly around the time that his son Absalom came after him, tried to take his throne, and what proceeded from there, which was a cascading failure of people in his life. Let's pick it up in verse 5. He says, now you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime, as if in battle. And with that blood he stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. And we'll stop there for just a minute. So David's political advice, so, he starts out, trust God, believe God, and then he quickly turns, you gotta take care of some things. This is housekeeping 101. You got to get the garbage out if you're going to have a nice time living at home. So his first order is to eliminate Joab. Now, Joab, if you remember going through 2 Samuel, Joab was kind of a love-hate. He was a very effective commander of the Lord's army. He was very effective, but he seemed to be amoral. As a military chief, he kind of went back and forth. And he crossed the line with David when he murdered his son, and then he murdered two other men in cold blood. But David couldn't bring himself to punish him. He couldn't bring himself to eliminate him as his own. Now, so why then, if David couldn't do it, why would he want Solomon to do it? And there's a lot of speculation about this. And a lot of it plays into kind of the political narrative. Some people look at this and they say, well, it seemed to be really important that people know that David didn't act in vengeance in killing him. That David wasn't going after him to be vindictive. But that to get rid of him is important so that everybody knows David didn't put Joab up to killing Abner. Okay, David didn't want that on him. In other words, that ordering the execution of Joab is going to clear David's name of any suspicion in those previous events. That's a possibility. There's other possibilities. One is David recognizes that Joab is a dangerous opponent. Remember, he backed Adonijah. So that makes him suspect. And why won't he back the next guy? Remember, Solomon let Adonijah live. So Adonijah's still alive. Joab's still alive. There's still a potential for trouble in the kingdom. Some people speculate that David wanted Joab dead because he's one of the few people that knew the truth about him and Bathsheba and Uriah, the murder of Uriah. I don't really buy that theory because we all know the secret. I think if Joab was the only one holding the bag and the only one that knew the darkness, well, somebody wrote it down. And I don't think this was a big secret. I think, obviously, it's not a secret to this day. And it wasn't by Joab's hand that got released. So I think the idea that that David was just trying to clean house and trying to protect his reputation from his failures in the past, I find that a weak idea. By and large, I think it has a lot to do with just protecting Solomon's throne. If we look at this in the continuity of the previous verses, he's giving him this powerful advice to rely on God, and then immediately says, you've got to deal with Joab. Now, why would he say that other than to say, I want your kingdom to be established? Right now, is Solomon's kingdom firm? Is it? No. It's not. Imagine being a leader in a nation and your first couple of weeks, you didn't appoint any of the generals, you didn't appoint any of the other officers, all the treaties were signed by other people, you're vulnerable. Until you can get your people in there that are faithful and loyal to you, you're vulnerable. Joab is one of those major influencer guys. This is like the Joint Chiefs. You got to put your own guys in there that are going to give you good advice, but are also not going to use the army against you. So I think that it makes the most sense. Verse 7, he continues. But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom. We're going to follow this example with another negative example. So sandwiched in between here is this brief moment of positivity. David is saying, listen, you got to execute these guys, but this guy, he's good, show him favor. And this is actually also good political counsel. Take care of your friends. And a lot of people kind of look at this as cronyism, but the reality is it's only kind of cronyism if you're on the outside. Right? If you're on the inside, it's like, yeah, I helped you get elected, or I helped you rise into office, you owe me, or a favor for a favor, or that's what friends do, however you want to state it. People call it cronyism when they're on the outside, but this is politics. And so I hope right now your mind is just thinking, man, nothing new under the sun. Yeah, there is, right? Nothing new under the sun. And we as Christians, Helen quotes Francis Schaeffer. I love this quote. He said, Christians should be unshockable. Right? Am I getting that quote right? I love that quote. Sometimes Christians are the most naive people because we want the best. We want to believe the best about everybody, and we want to imagine that everybody is pure and innocent. The reality is no one is. And so we need to be harmless as doves, but wise as serpents, right? So he, in the midst of this, there is this positive counsel. If you remember back in 2 Samuel 17, Barzillai provided food and bedding when David was on the run from his son Absalom, who was trying to kill him. Okay, brief moment of joy here, and then back to misery. Let's go to verse 8. And remember, you have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. Now, if you remember that instance, we were kind of puzzled. It's like, I think David had learned from his time when he was reactionary before. His first instinct was to kill. Somebody comes against him, kill him. And he'd learned through some wise counsel of a wonderful woman, he learned that that wasn't the best way to go all the time. So here he comes, Shimei's down there by the river cursing him, and he showed restraint. And so we wanted to applaud that. But apparently that restraint was outward only, because inside, David remembers that. And inside, David says, that's got to be dealt with. But David isn't being bitter here. He's actually being biblical. It was in the law of Moses. What Shimei did was a crime according to God's law. And that crime was punishable by, guess what? Death. So David's restraint was actually the least biblical, but I think he was doing it for personal reasons at the time. Plus, you got to remember, he was on the run from his son who was trying to kill him. So he was probably struggling with that as well. That's a hard pill to swallow. Nevertheless, now he turns to Absalom, says, remember this guy. He continues, verse 9, he says, but now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. So he's encouraging Solomon to find a shrewd way to deal with him. Now, the problem is, to execute someone, the king still needs a reason, and it needs to be a good reason. Otherwise, he sets himself against the people. So that's why he says, you have wisdom, you'll figure it out. And he does. So we'll see that here in just a moment. And then we come to the brief exchange on David's death. Verses 10 through 12. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Some scholars read this 40, and they take it in a metaphoric sense to say a generation. But here I think it was actually 40 because of how it's broken down, a 7 and a 33. Those are very literal numbers. Those are not symbolic numbers by any means. So he was 7 years over Judah and 33-year reign over the combined Israel and Judah. So he reigned 40 years, not coincidentally, but Saul also reigned 40 years. David was 70 when he died. Saul, we're going to guess, is about 80, maybe a little bit older when he died. But what polar opposites, right? David died in peace. Solomon died in battle. David died in victory. I keep saying Solomon. Saul David and Saul. Saul was a little over 80 or a little bit older when he died. David died in peace. Saul died in battle. Let me get that right. David died in victory. Saul in defeat. When David started reigning, who was really dominating the land was the Philistines. When Solomon began to reign, now not Saul, but Solomon begins to reign, Israel is at peace and in control of all of its neighbors. In fact, he's going to supervise and superintend the greatest expansion of land in the nation. It's incredible. So a big contrast between David and his predecessor Saul, which sets up a greater opportunity to transfer power from David to Solomon. The historian Josephus records an interesting thing. Interesting just if you like treasure hunting, which I do. Josephus says that David was buried with an enormous amount of his wealth. That's not in the Bible. In fact, it's not anywhere else. He's the only one that I'm aware of that records that. He was rich, so it's possible. It's certainly possible. But that was not really a Jewish thing to do. That's more of an Egyptian thing to do. But David's kingdom was large. He was powerful. He was rich. It's certainly possible. Of course, that tomb would have been raided multiple times over the centuries. All right, so that's kind of the setup to Solomon's reign. Now, as David is dead and Solomon takes over, he has to do what his father told him to do, and that's a little bit of house cleaning. So he jumps in with Adonijah's execution. Now, David hadn't mentioned Adonijah, so Solomon's going to own this one himself. Verse 13. Now, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. Bathsheba asked him, "Do you come peacefully?" He answered, "Yes, peacefully." Then he added, "I have something to say to you. You may say it." She replied. "As you know," he said, "the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as their king. But things changed, and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. Now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me." "You may make it," she said. So he continued, "Please ask King Solomon, he will not refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife." "Very well," Bathsheba replied, "I will speak to the king for you." When Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, the king stood up to meet her, bowed down to her, and sat down on his throne. He had a throne brought for the king's mother, and she sat down at his right hand. "I have one small request to make of you," she said. "Do not refuse me." The king replied, "Make it, my mother. I will not refuse you." So she said, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah." King Solomon answered his mother, "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar the priest and for Joab the son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request. And now, as surely as the Lord lives, he who has established me securely on the throne of my father David and has founded a dynasty for me, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." So King Solomon gave orders to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he struck down Adonijah, and he died. What's going on here? This is not about the Shunammite woman. It's not about Abishag. There's layers here going. So now, just to remind us, who is Adonijah? Well, he's the one that, as David was laying on his deathbed, he decided to get a following, become really popular, and get people to start talking about him as if he is king. Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet went to David and made sure that Solomon was made king in his place, and Adonijah was allowed to live, but now he's up to no good. Asking for the woman. This is the woman that slept in David's bed to keep him warm. They didn't have sexual relations, but she slept in his bed to keep him warm. What is the big deal? David's had a lot of women. Adonijah's asking for one. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is cultural. The big deal is cultural. When it was common knowledge that when someone would take the harem or part of the harem of a king, he was asserting his right to sit in that king's place. This is Adonijah making another play for the throne. Solomon is in play right here, but Adonijah is trying to end around, thinking that because he went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, that he's going to be able to pull a fast one here. That's why Solomon's reply tells us everything we know. He said, why ask for her? You might as well ask for the kingdom. And then he throws in the second part. After all, he is my older brother, which is the other thing. In the culture, the eldest brother of the former king would be normally, in the ancient Near East, would be the normal one to follow the king. Solomon was not even near the oldest. Some say he was the youngest. I don't think that's provable, but he certainly wasn't the oldest. So Solomon immediately saw what was going on. And there's a word for that. It's treason. This is treason. This is what it actually looks like. Adonijah was making a play for the throne. Now, the only weird part about this is Bathsheba. You know, is she stupid? Is she a useful idiot? I mean, is that what's going on here? I don't think so at all. I think she knew what the reaction would be, and this would end it once and for all. Why? Because Solomon did need to take care of Adonijah, but he needed to do it in a righteous way. When a man's trying to commit treason, that's a righteous way. He can execute him. All is above board. So when he comes and asks Bathsheba, it's hard to imagine that she didn't realize, okay, go ahead and get the steak, skip the salad, have extra dessert. It's your last day on earth. I think she probably knew. And so she carried it forward, just straight-faced, and she carried it forward to Solomon. Solomon doesn't show any annoyance with her. Not really. It's the annoyance is obviously with Adonijah. So that plays out, and he is off the farm. He's out of the picture now. Another possible twist to this is that Solomon had already met and brought into his harem the Shunammite woman. Because there is the possibility, we cannot know this for sure, but there is the possibility that she is the one that's mentioned in the Song of Solomon, which is a love poem. I don't believe Song of Solomon is about the church. Some people interpret it that way. I don't think that at all. I think it's about love and sex. And it's a great and powerful book. And this woman that Solomon adored is at the center of that book. And so this might be the third reason, if Solomon needed three, to be annoyed at Adonijah. He's trying to take the throne. Well, he's asking for something that doesn't belong to him. And, he is the older brother. And, this is a woman maybe that Solomon already cared about. Seems a little fast to me, but it's certainly a possibility. Or it's entirely possible that Adonijah's request put this woman on Solomon's radar, and that's how the relationship began. So we don't know. But in that sense, that is over. The next episode of Cleaning House is Abiathar's firing. This is in just two quick verses, 26 and 27. To Abiathar the priest, the king said, "Go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will not put you to death now because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father David and shared all my father's hardships." So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word of the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. Sorry, the text there is so small. So he's giving Abiathar basically parole. He's going to let him live. He's not putting him to death. And primarily because he carried the ark. And that is a certainly exalted position. And this is an interesting thing from Solomon, because Solomon's going to struggle with idolatry in his life. And it's going to grow over the course of his days as we see it in these books. But you can see a deep reverence here, or at least an acknowledgement of the importance of the ark of the Lord. And it's, not far from him. I believe David had brought it. If you remember, he brought it to Jerusalem. So it's just up the hill from him. It's sitting there, and it is a sacred object. It contains the 10 Commandments of Moses, Aaron's rod that budded, and a pot of manna. And it is where the presence of the Lord guided the people of Israel through the wilderness wanderings as they came out of Egypt. This is an important piece. And so he spares Abiathar because he was one of the carriers of that, and that he was with David through many difficult times. And so he removes him, and this is actually a direct fulfillment of the cross, of the curse on Eli back in 1 Samuel chapter 2, right at the very start of our Old Testament study, where Eli is being punished that no one from his line would serve, that they would all be cut off. And Abiathar's the last one, and there'll never be another, and this is it. So this fulfills that curse that God had pronounced on Eli's line. It's ended because he did not obey the Lord faithfully. And then finally we get to, or not finally, but next we get to Joab's execution. When the news reached Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, though not with Absalom, he fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. Now the tent of the Lord is the tabernacle. It's just up the hill. He runs up there. He doesn't run in and grab hold of the Ark of the Covenant. Why not? Well, he died, right? There's an immediate curse on that. People have died just to touch it. But he says he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Now, in this era, there's very different types of altars in this perspective. Some are large. This is a movable bronze one that have been carried through the wilderness. You'll see a lot of these in different cities as they're excavated. Basically, just a raised platform where a sacrifice can be made, and then some would be just massive. This is the size of the one that Solomon will build when he builds the temple. Just tremendous altar. But as far as Joab's concerned, he was probably grabbing hold of something like this. And these corner uprisings here are the horns of the altar. And in the law, in Leviticus, the priest would put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of incense and before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The rest of the blood would be poured out at the base of the burnt offering. So this is just part of the furniture. Now, we've already seen someone go into the tabernacle and grab hold as if he's requesting now sanctuary, that concept of sanctuary. This is the Lord's house. Sacrifices that are made here, God's got to protect me. That's nowhere promised. The only time we see a promise of sanctuary are in the city of refuge. But that's generally for manslaughter, not murder. And Joab is guilty of murder. So there's really no biblical precedent for him to ask for and receive a reprieve from human judgment. Okay, but this is what he does. I think, because remember, Adonijah had done the same thing. He ran in to the tent, grabbed hold, and Solomon spared him. So Joab tries to do the same thing. King Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and was beside the altar. Then Solomon ordered Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, to go strike him down. So Benaiah entered the tent of the Lord and said to Joab, the king says, come out. But he answered, no, I will die here. Benaiah reported to the king, this is how Joab answered me. This reminds me of those protesters that glued themselves to things. I'm like, they've not thought this through. You kind of feel sorry for them because it's like, you can't imagine them fasting for the rest of the afternoon. Not to mention, I'm going to die here. That's not going to happen. So maybe it's noble, but it just doesn't seem to be the best course of action. But he says, this is how I'm going to go. Then the king commanded Benaiah, do as he says, strike him down and bury him, and so clear me and my whole family of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab shed. So from Solomon's perspective, the stink of David letting Joab live even after Joab shed innocent blood. Solomon's taking David's advice because he knows this has to end. And Solomon is going to have a kingdom of peace. David was a man of war. Solomon is going to be a man of peace and prosperity. He is going to expand the kingdom, and he's going to do it through treaties and intermarriage and all kinds of ways. but he's not going to do it through war. And so he's got to get rid of this murderer. And so he says, do it. Strike him down. Verse 32, the Lord will repay him for the blood he shed, because without my father David knowing it, he attacked 2 men and killed them with the sword. Both of them, Abner, son of Ner, commander of Israel's army, and Amasa, son of Jether, commander of Judah's army, were better men and more upright than he. May the guilt of their blood rest on the head of Joab and his descendants forever. But on David and his descendants, his house and his throne, may there be the Lord's peace forever. So Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, went up and struck down Joab and killed him, and he was buried at his home out in the country. Now, this is an interesting kind of postscript there. They didn't just throw him into a potter's field. They didn't just let the dogs take his body. They actually buried him on his own land. And so it's a little bit of twist in the sense that he was a murderer and he had to be dealt with, but he had still served the Lord. He had still done his part, so they allowed him the dignity to be buried on his own land. This last part here, he was buried at his home out of the country. That's honor. That's a type of honor. I mean, he's guilty, but he still had done good things. Sometimes people think, well, somebody's guilty. They are anathema. We're just going to cast them out. We're going to forget about them. And you see this is the cancel culture, right? We don't see that here. People have done good things and then made bad mistakes. They got to pay for the bad mistakes often, but it doesn't nullify the good that they did. In my field, working with pastors, it seems like every day there's another pastor, some celebrity pastor that's gotten famous, and he's falling hard. And people want to act as if he never did anything good for the Lord. That breaks my heart. And I think, okay, I understand that he might be done in ministry, but take him and bury him at his home in the country. Okay, give him honor to recognize that what he did was good. There's not a sinless pastor out there. Every one of them, if you look deep enough, are going to disappoint you. Every one of them. And so I think this gives us a good model of forget the cancel culture. Right? I'm not saying Joab deserved to die. Yeah, this is just. But it doesn't erase that he did serve the army of the Lord and did things that were courageous and bold. So that's my 2 cents on that. The king put Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over the army in Joab's position and replaced Abiathar with Zadok, the priest. And that leads us finally to Shimei. Shimei's execution in 36 to 46. Then the king sent for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. Okay, this is the first biblical lockdown. Don't think he had to wear a mask, but he could not leave Jerusalem. You say, what's the big deal? Jerusalem's an amazing city. Well, it is now. But in this day, you could draw a circle around Jerusalem. The circumference, would be about 4,500 feet. Okay, it wasn't that big. This was an open prison. I mean, this was the Old Testament equivalent of an ankle bracelet. Okay, so he told him, he says, get comfortable. You're staying in Jerusalem. Now, why create that rule? He made the rule so that Shimei would break it. It's the only reason. Shimei's no danger to him. Remember, Shimei, this guy cursed his father, David. And with that, he deserves death. But that was a long time ago. Those witnesses are gone. Solomon needs to deal with him for that crime, but he needs a contemporary crime to charge him with. And this guy could just wander away and never face justice. So he says, you have to stay in Jerusalem. And I think he created that law, that rule, so Shimei would break it. Notice this. Shimei answered the king, what you say is good. Your servant will do as my lord the king has said. And Shimei stayed in Jerusalem for a long time. But 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran off to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. And Shimei was told, your slaves are in Gath. At this, he saddled his donkey and went to Achish at Gath in search of his slaves. So Shimei went away and brought the slaves back from Gath. When Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had returned, the king summoned Shimei and said to him, Did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, on the day you leave to go anywhere else, you can be sure you will die? At that time you said to me, what you say is good. I will obey. Why then did you not keep your oath to the Lord and obey the command I gave you? The king also said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. See, there's the connection. That's what he's really being punished for. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing. Oops. But King Solomon would be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. Then the king gave the order to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down, and he died. The kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. And that was the whole point of the housekeeping. He had to deal with those fringe enemies that were known to cause trouble for David, who could also cause trouble for Solomon. And I just think it's ironic timing as being in a political season ourselves. I find it amusing that people, I don't know, I guess they're act shocked that politicians do political things. There's actually a lot of thought that goes into that. I'm not justifying it. I don't really care that much. Human politics is irrelevant, largely in the outworking of God's plan. So many kings and kingdoms and queens have come and gone. And so many times people were sat under their reigns and imagined that this was the worst thing that could ever happen. And they're all dead. And we don't even know their names. You know, there's been 46 presidents. Can you name just the U.S. presidents? I think I can get most of them. I think I can. That'd be pretty close. But I couldn't tell you one ruler of Australia or New Zealand, except for the last chick, because she was funny. Yeah, I can remember. But I can't remember. Jakarta, what's your name? Jacinda. Okay. See, I don't even remember Jacinda. Yeah. These rulers come and go, yet the Lord remains. The Lord remains. So I think when we look at politics on an earthly, and this is my encouragement, how do we take this truth out of this chapter and apply it to our lives? Don't sweat politics. Be interested, be involved, watch the news, vote, all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But don't let it stress you. There is one who is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Always has been, always will be. The only reason we ever got Saul was people couldn't wait for God's appointed. That's the only reason. And so let's learn that lesson, that there'll never be a human ruler that will make us feel great. Might feel good for a day. Might be happy about something. But will never satisfy what only God can satisfy. Amen? Isn't that true? All right. Good. All right. Tough stuff. All right. Next week we get a really cool prayer, and it's a really short chapter. It'll be fun. All right. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much, Lord, for your love for us. Thank you for these examples that we can learn from. Lord, we don't speak ill of David or Solomon. We should only hope to accomplish even a tenth of what they did in their lives. They were men of faith, and they were men of tremendous passions who also failed. And Lord, we are men and women of faith, and we are men and women of tremendous passions, and we also fail. And so we don't sit in judgment of them, but we want to learn from their example so that we can live our lives the best possible way. That we can live by faith in the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We can live by faith in the one who gave himself for us, the one who offered himself up and made it possible for us to have an unhindered relationship with the God of all the universe. And for that we're grateful. And so, Lord, I pray for everyone here and for our community, Lord, that people would not stress, that they wouldn't stress over politics in Canada or the U.S. or New Zealand, or even the 27 political parties in Costa Rica. Lord, none of this is worth stressing about because you reign. You always have.